Jenny Just, one of the first women to trade in the Chicago Options Exchange floor when there wasn't even a women's restroom. In 1997, she co-founded Peak Six with $1.5 million. Today, it's a multi-billion-dollar fintech giant, supporting companies including Robinhood, SoFi, and Betterment, and employing twice as many female fund managers as the industry average. Now she's teaching 1 million women poker and the skills that come with it: courage, risk-taking, and getting to the table. A 2025 CNBC changemaker and self-made billionaire, Jenny Just is in the Changemakers and Power Players spotlight. Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time. The last time I saw you, I think it was at the CNBC Changemaker Summit, where I got to interview you on stage. It was a joint interview with Bella Bajaria, the head of content for Netflix, which was awesome. And then you joined us afterwards for this dinner with all the other changemakers. And I really felt like you were such a star of that dinner because everyone wanted to hear about poker power. And I want to start there because you are a self-made billionaire, you're an investor, you've had this incredible career, but now your most recent chapter is also about teaching women poker. Tell us, before we get started with how you went on this journey, I heard you've been teaching poker to some of the other CNBC changemakers.
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me. It's always a delight to see you. And yes, we love our change makers. We have lots of conversations. It's an incredible group that you've spawned, and I think is going to grow for so long, right? We're going to know all of each other. So, and getting some to play poker is hilarious, frankly, because, poker is this weird societal cultural phenomenon that women have never participated in. So when you get really talented senior women playing, they are just delighted to participate and finally know and go, wait, this is all that's going on, right? This game, it's so simple, but there's so much depth behind it, and they start to use it and think about it and use it as a framework for how they make decisions and how they teach risk to, up and coming women in their organizations. So it's been a real treat. When we call it our high low, we try and go in high in an organization, but we always try and get the youngest women learning. So for our change makers, I'm so grateful that they're willing to take risks themselves to learn a game that frankly feels really uncomfortable, even as an experienced person, and then go in and teach the young women in their lives.
Yeah, I thought it was so great to get to interview you and Bella Bajari on stage, and then hear afterwards, she was like, I want to do this. I want to train my executives how to do this.
And her daughters. And her daughters.
And her daughters, how to do, how to understand how to play poker. So I did one of your poker events years ago. I had never really played poker before. I had participated in poker games, never successfully. And I am intimidated by poker. I should say I was intimidated by poker. And you had a team of experts to teach how to play poker very simply and accessibly. You put some rules on a playing card, yep, which I relied on.
Yes, of course.
But let's back up here. How do you go from being a billionaire, self-made investor, CEO, founder, to launching a program to teach 1 million women poker?
Yes, not a typical course. And the truth is nobody on the planet has ever figured out how to get women to play this game, right? There's small groups over the years, we're talking about thousands of women at a time, some, but we've never been in the millions ever in the history of this game of several hundred years. And I was not one of them. So more importantly, I thought just like everybody else did. And despite having this interesting career trajectory, I looked at poker exactly the same, which is boys' game. It's a waste of time. I have no interest, and sort of accidentally started playing. My daughter was playing a tennis match and losing.
And at the time you were running Peak Six,
I was running
huge financial.
Yeah, this
huge financial firm.
2019. Yeah. So I'm running our we have several companies. So Peak Six is a company of companies, primarily in the fintech space. Started as a trading firm and has really moved on to the technology side. And And there are many, many traders who, litter poker players. And I just ignored it always. And one of my partners is, he played at a really senior level, and I never even asked a question about it, right? I never even asked a question. And so my daughter she's 14, 2019, losing a tennis match. Her dad comes home because she's a very good athlete. Probably should beat this girl based just on skill level, and says, she may as well be hitting against a wall. She doesn't realize she's playing against someone who's thinking and strategizing. She needs to learn to play poker. And I was like, what? He's not really a poker player. I definitely wasn't a poker player. And I walked away. And like two weeks later, I thought to myself, should I teach my 14-year-old daughter to play poker? And then I got frustrated because I would never have asked that about my sons. I have 3 sons. They're older than her. They, of course, already knew how to play, which I didn't even know they knew how to play. And so then I was definitely frustrated. I'm like, we have to try something here. So typical entrepreneur, do an experiment. I get 10 girls, so they're 8th and 9th grade girls, and then their moms want to join. So 10 girls, 10 moms. And the only reason you and I know each other and that I'm so lucky to be part of this Changemaker group is because of those 4 one-hour poker lessons with those girls, which gives me a shiver every time I think about it, because like, what a crazy concept. I was a very quiet person for 20 to almost 25 years because I was like, I do equity options trading. I do back-end technology. It's not that interesting. It's successful, but so I said no to everything. I didn't have something tangible that I thought could be useful. All of a sudden in this poker game, besides the confidence in the young girls, when I start to learn, I go, that looks like my work. That looks like the trading that I learned that helped me to learn to take risk around money all these years. That looks like that deal I just negotiated. And I started to use it as a framework internally at Peak 6.
But so you do these 4 lessons for these 10 girls and their moms. And over the course of those 4 lessons, you start to realize that this is really connected to your success and your experience in the financial world. So how did you go from those 4 lessons to launching this program to teach women poker around the world?
Right. I definitely didn't have an intention of starting a company. But so we started teaching more young girls, my daughter and I, and we went out there and had these programs. COVID comes and we're like, well, I guess we'll see you when this little thing is over. And then, of course, it wasn't over. And we said, well, maybe we'll try it on Zoom. And then we went out. So under the Peak 6 family, there's several thousand people. And so we said, we'll go out to those families and we'll try and teach their daughters, their sisters and their nieces. And as we did, the Peak 6 women said, well, if it's so good for them, why aren't we learning? And so at this point, right, I'm still on my personal poker journey, right? So it's been about 10 months since I've learned the game. And all of these, ideas haven't come to fruition yet for me. So we start to teach them. And so now I'm like, well, I better get my act together and really get going on this game. And then Morningstar, who we know, large international research firm, came out and said, financial firm, like, can you do that for us? And fast forward to today, we've been at 370 some odd organizations in this country, largest banks, largest tech firms, largest law firms in 60 countries, person by person, woman by woman. And then now, of course, we include men in there too, if they're interested. Starting at the very, very beginning, the very basics, you need to know nothing about this game to come in and learn with us and understand what it's all about. So it went from 0 to something, not intentionally. The goal is not to have a company because that means it's just part of our society that girls and women play this game. But today it is. And it's aggressively going in terms of, online and in person, teaching women every single day, girls and women every single day.
So what do you think teaching poker actually teaches? What did you see it teach your daughter and her friends? And why is it so valuable for people to learn poker in terms of navigating business?
Sure. So I think there's, the initial, right? We have a curriculum and our first lesson is about courage because getting to that table is a really big deal for girls, women, all ages to get to that table. I have to tell you, the more senior they are is often the more difficult to get them to the table. They are learning a litany of skills. Most important, in my opinion, are how to make decisions under pressure with incomplete information. So that is happening over and over again. And why it's important, because when you play poker, you have to play to win. You're not playing not to lose. And because if you're conservative in the game, you'll ultimately be what they call blinded out by the antes that have to go around every single part of the game. The other thing is strategy. Understanding strategy, generally speaking, in our play and our hobbies, I would say we get less experience doing this than boys and men do as they're growing up. Who am I playing? How are they playing? What position are they relative to me? And what are the different outcomes that are possible? The other thing is, for sure, at the top of the list is capital allocation. How do I use my resources? How do I use my chips to get more chips? And leveraging that ability in business and in life, right? We have our resources, we have our money, whatever those resources are. How do I use it most effectively to benefit the upside and protect the downside? And again, it's a mind shift. For me, when I look at the women in particular at my own company, because it's been there now for 28 years, and for us to elevate women to the most senior levels, where do they get stuck? And it's taking risk around money. They just do. And I don't think it's a problem per se, because if you want to keep going, you have to be good at doing that. And if you want to go to the next level, I literally had this conversation with a senior woman at our firm who has extraordinary skills, but her money skills and her ability to take risk around money have hit a ceiling, and she has to change. And she doesn't have to if she doesn't want to, but ultimately those money tables are where the power is. And if you want to affect change, you have to be comfortable at those tables.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So thinking about how what you're talking about here is managing risk, strategizing, and making decisions with imperfect information. That to me sounds exactly like what you did in your career up until the point when you learned poker.
That's right.
So I'm wondering, was there something that you learned studying poker that you hadn't known despite having so much success in your career?
For sure. So there are two things with this, and they are crystal clear for me. One is I learned patience, the extraordinary amount of patience it takes to be strategic. I'm not known for my patience at all. And it's you have a lot of self-awareness when you start to play poker about your physical self, about your mental self. And you don't test yourself in that way anywhere else, especially as, I'm in my late 20s when we start our firm by ourselves, and there's nobody around me necessarily giving me the criticism. Like, how am I going to constructively get better every single day? And so I say, the other thing I say besides patience is I think I could have saved 10 years of losses off my career if I had learned poker sooner.
You could have shaved 10 years of losses off your career if you learned poker sooner.
Yep.
What does that even mean? And how so?
Because the errors that I made, so we talk about something called compound experience. Like, the more I get reps in, the more I understand, the more I learn, the more my baseline grows. So again, limiting my downside in certain scenarios that I understand and opening up the upside. And poker would have just given me more reps. Remember, I come into my job as an options trader, learning a skill. Like, you're an accountant and you learn how to do accounting. I learned how to do options trading. That's where I got my reps. When you talk about boys and men are doing that when they're 10 or 8, and then they do it again when they're 14, 16, and then they're doing it when they're 18. They're getting so many reps, and there's in so many different ways they're doing it. These days, of course, there's obviously so much retail trading going on, but there's also so much sports betting going on. They are taking those reps and getting those reps all the time. And I was a really, my co-founder and myself have very complementary skills, but I think I would have understood more about what he was doing and why he was making certain decisions, and then what I was countering with if I had been more informed. And I just had to get those reps myself because I had not had them. So as an options trader, I get certain kinds of reps. As a business I get different kinds. So, and, I always talk about this long list of fails that we have, and we make sure, all of our senior leaders, they know it. We have it. Right now, I don't have a desk because we're in a new office, but like it's usually right there, right next to me on my desk, just as a reminder. And I think embedding all of those mistakes, if I could have crunched them down in that window sooner, I would have just been in a different place.
And do you think it's that you would have been more comfortable taking risks, so you would have failed faster and learned faster from the failures?
That's definitely part of it. I think when you learn more, when those experiences compound, right, you get that exponential growth. I forgot. I said to someone the other day, a student who was asking me about what they should do. I said, if you go into a law firm and you go into their financial practice, you're going to learn an angle and approach problems different than an intern who just goes into trading, right? So all of these different angles, they compound on each other and you have exponential growth. I was lucky enough to be an entrepreneur inside of the company I worked at when I was 24, 25 years old. Each one of those just opens up your aperture a little bit more. So if I can do more, and hopefully they're not all losses. It's when you're dealing in money every day, like we are in particular in trading, there's a lot, right? So if you talk about our trading, we're losing 46% of the time and winning 50 some odd percent of the time. So relative to the average, profession, it's not that high. So I needed a lot of reps and I just didn't have a lot. But that's why the average person, gosh, if we can get our young girls playing, when they're 8, 10, 12 years old. I mean, it was critical that Juliet was 14 because 18 to 22 is our hardest time to teach these girls because it's so not the norm for them to play this game and such the norm for the boys to really accelerate in college into this risk taking. We just have to do it sooner. And I know for me, I'm extraordinarily lucky to be where we are at our firm. It would have been a bigger firm if I had learned sooner.
That's incredible considering how massive your multi-billion-dollar firm is. That could have been bigger.
Yeah.
But also, just before we move on, I just want to highlight what you were saying about the importance of a nonlinear career path and the value that everyone gets from having these different experiences. And then also the power that we have as we get older. I think there's so much pressure on entrepreneurs to start early and to know exactly what they want to do right out of the gate. The reality is that there's so much opportunity as these experiences layer upon themselves. I want to go back to the beginning because you mentioned you and your co-founder have very complementary approaches. And you did start your company relatively young, but you have such an awesome founding story. So you start off on the trading floor, but walk us through how you went from a trader to being a business founder.
So I started right out of school on the trading floor, actually screaming and yelling, and moved off the trading floor. And in my mid-20s, like I said, we opened the over-the-counter trading desk. Swiss Bank did a joint venture with the company I was at. So my co-founder was there for that. So there's two of us and a Goldman gentleman came in, and the three of us were starting this thing, which is kind of hilarious. But
because you're in your late 20s, you had never founded anything before.
No. And, the fact that the firm we were at, O'Connor and Associates, it's an infamous options trading firm, but they were taking the risk on some young people to start this group, but took off very quickly. And the volume was much bigger than the exchange traded volume. And so we just got a totally different perspective on the size of the market. And so it makes you think different about all that trading that's happening on the floor every day. But they then became Swiss Bank, UBS, and they're moving. And so we didn't want to move. We were in Chicago. Matt had actually come from New York to Chicago to start.
And Matt is your co-founder.
My co-founder, exactly. So we said, well, we'll just do that thing again because we just did it, which is also wildly naive because you need a credit rating. You need, a big balance sheet to be able to do what we're doing. But we're like, well, we'll just partner with somebody. And so we left. There was actually supposed to be a third person who joined and didn't at the last minute, had just had a baby and decided not to. And so we put our mind to doing this same thing that we did there over here. But what happened as we started down the process was, this is going to take a long time. What are we going to do in the meantime? We have no funds. I was a single mom with a 1-year-old. And so we were nervous. So let's start trading. And as we started to trade, technology was changing. Now, we're talking 1997, 1998. And we became one of the first off-exchange floor trading firms, meaning instead of standing in the pit, you could do the same thing, but do it from up in the office. And which sounds ridiculous today when I say it, makes me sound really old, but it allowed us to execute on multiple exchanges without populating those floors. We were 27, 28 years old. We didn't know how to manage people. We'd never done that before. And so very quickly, we ramped up and we're competing, right? When you're trading, when you're in options trading, you're competing with the biggest hedge funds and the biggest banks in the world. And because we had come from O'Connor where we did it, it was very natural for us just go in and compete at that same level with the same people. So started with $1.5 million. A handful of our partners at O'Connor joined us, and some friends and family, but we never had to go back. We returned all that money pretty early, actually, to those investors, and didn't have to raise again, and just grew self-funded through those trading profits into what we are today. And when we didn't know how to reuse that capital, we started doing other things, hence all the mistakes. But some of those things were really good. We built a retail broker-dealer pre-Robinhood. So think the generation prior to that. And we built a firm called Options House, which we ran for a long time and then sold. Eventually when it became E-Trade, became part of E-Trade rather. We had a hedge fund that we eventually sold. And then we got into the custody and clearing business as a result of a very large situation with our clearing firm in 2012. And that today is the back end technology for like 65% of the fintechs that are on this planet. So,
wow.
Yeah, so we went from trading on, and lean hard now on the tech side.
Yeah, that's incredible. And also just to think you started with $1.5 million, and how much are all these companies worth today? What's the total valuation?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's definitely billions,
Billions,
So,
billions.
yeah.
So you mentioned very casually that you were a single mother with a very young child
Mm-hmm.
when you started this company. Was that hard or scary, or how did you manage that?
So,
because you had another person who was going to join, but had a young child, so decided not to. So
yes, exactly.
Why did it make sense for you to take this risk?
I don't think it made sense, and I did it anyway. I think I was naive enough to think, like, why not? So, right, when you take an entrepreneurial journey in 1997, it's so different than today because it's so there's so much talk about it. It wasn't even a sexy thing to do. Right. We're just going to go from there. We're going to go sit over here instead. And in trading firms, there were a lot of small pods of trading groups that would pop up. And so we're like, well, if we're just one of those, if that's what it becomes, that's okay too, because lots of people can make good money. Today, it's much harder to do that because the weight of the technology is so much more that just being a couple people in a room is a lot harder, unless you just sort of retail trading. But so I didn't overthink it for sure. And I guess if I didn't have the experience inside of O'Connor Swiss Bank, I probably never would have done it because we just started something from scratch. Someone just said go and we went. So I think it was easy being kind of naive about the whole thing. But
what would your advice be to other people, though, who may be considering such a big leap?
Well, so this is the thing. I think when you start, so we didn't have the vision of what we have today, right? That wasn't. But I think it's starting and doing something, right? It's like when you started writing your book, right? We've talked about how you decided to do that in the past. It's a big deal to write a book. And I think getting that first chapter done and putting one foot in front of the other, because seeing all the way down that line of what it might entail, there was a young woman actually I spoke to recently who said this summer, instead of doing a traditional internship, I want to start this beverage company. And I was like, oh, and I don't know if she saw my expression, but the history of beverage companies are that it's really hard. I go, but if you're going to do it ever, right? Whatever you learn is going to be so valuable to whatever else, anything else you do, that someone's going to hire you because you A, took that risk, and B, you learned so much from that experience. So I think the hardest part is the money, right? The hardest part is recognizing the sacrifices you have to make. And if you're ready for that, that's why I say putting one foot in front of the other and sort of parallel pathing, or having an opportunity because of COVID or some other thing that comes around in your life, that you have a period of time where you can focus and start to see what the process is about. The other big thing is there's, we just did a big partnership with iFund Women. And so I've just been talking to all these new entrepreneurs who are, many of them, are in their late 20s, but many are in their, mid to early 40s. And there's so much more you can do today. I don't think there's a rush to do it. I think you learn so much by being at great organizations, and then you figure out who you want to be. Right? You can be starting these companies in your 50s or your 60s today. I mean, even older for sure. So
yeah,
I just don't think it's not a race, I think, is the biggest thing. And to get your thoughts down on paper and to put some pieces into action. Any small action will be really informative to if you want to do it or not.
Well, it's what you said about how the reps are so valuable.
Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning from a career trajectory standpoint that you co-founded this company as a single mom with a young child, and then you ended up later marrying your co-founder.
I did.
Who is now your partner, both in life and at work.
Yes.
6 years
after we started Peak Six. Yeah.
6 years after you started Peak Six, you married your co-founder. Now, what's it like to run this company with your husband?
Well, it wasn't easy, that's for sure. Nobody would have guessed that we would have ended up together, because having two people start a company versus, three, where there's a tiebreaker, right? We used to say he or she who has the most passion wins. And so there were a lot of wars. I think, net and in the full cycle of the 28 years, right, we're super lucky because there's a lot of meat. There's a lot that we share together and a lot that we work on. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it's wildly hard in so many ways, but also having our kids see and participate and be part of it. It's really a heartwarming experience to, some of them are starting to participate in full-time ways, and some in part-time ways, and our internships. And, we're just super grateful that we have that opportunity. We were with a couple who, a husband-wife couple, same thing recently. And they're like, and they're younger. And they're like, what do people talk about otherwise? And I'm like, well, I think people don't want to necessarily talk about work all the time. So I think there are certain types of people who it's really conducive for. And when it works, it can really work well. And we complement each other quite well, I think.
And so how do you complement each other? What is your particular style?
So literally this morning, Matt said, I feel sorry for our kids because they have both of us in them. So he's well, we used to say he's top down, I'm bottoms up. He's the outside person, I'm the inside person. Over time.
And what does that mean, bottom up, inside person?
Well, so he was always more of a strategic thinker. Again, stuff that I had to learn. I was in all the details, and it's not that he didn't understand the trade detail, right? But he was more of a barbell, and I did the whole rung on the ladder, right? Who's gonna make this thing an actual system, an actual operating company? That was really, that was my job. And I think, right, from who's the personality that's at the poker table? I was definitely, he's the patient, quiet one. I'm the more aggressive one, right? And probably too aggressive in many ways. So we always were quite opposite of each other. I think we both have an extraordinary work ethic that really helped. So we were on the same page in terms of what to do and when to do and how to do it. But, he's known to be the guy who gets us into shit and I have to get us out of it. So, he'll take risk in different ways than I do. Our very first employee, who's now retired, but we used to say we were 3 legs of a stool, and we complemented each other quite well in sort of all respects. We really got lucky in that way.
How do you think you have evolved as a leader since you started your entrepreneurial journey, but more specifically since you started this work around poker?
So, many ways. And hopefully, people here recognize that. I do think we have a personal responsibility they see us as one way, but to continue to evolve and be a better leader and person. I historically operated from a place of fear a lot. And in retrospect, it was probably fear of risk, which I didn't quite understand. And now I know that I can think more methodically and logically about that and contextualize it rather than come from a place of emotion about it. Because I would take the risk, but I would feel so much of the risk. And that meant everybody else is going to feel it too. So back to my patience in poker and just observing other people who are doing similar things. I think, I wasn't a public person for so long. And, hopefully just being with people like yourself and other change makers and our similar friends, I learn a lot, about what motivates other people and why do people want to follow and be a part of the team. We're very lucky. I think we've done some things right. I want to, it's not all about change all the time. People at Peak Six stay for a really long time. And sometimes that's not always good, but we're doing something right culturally. And I think that's because we're constantly challenging ourselves to be better.
You have succeeded in an incredibly male-dominated world. And especially decades ago when it was even more male dominated than it is now. Did that ever impact you or intimidate you? Or do you have any advice to women trying to navigate that now, those spaces?
Yeah, I think it's tricky and newly tricky again in this last year. So again, I think I was lucky. I grew up with 4 brothers, so that my perception was that I was always around all kinds of, boys and men. When I got to the trading floor, my very first or second day, there was a gentleman who came over to me, who was on our team, and said, "Don't worry, I'll protect you." And I was like, "From what?" So. And there's lots of back then, right? There's, that was early 90s, they're hooting and hollering and things, there's not many women down on the floor. And when they get bored, they got to do something. So what was going to happen, silly stuff happened on the floor and I didn't really belong. But I was used to that. I think as time went by though, I started to see it as we got bigger. We wanted to do bigger things when we had external things and help people. I was, for sure in the 90s, if I came in the room, it's because I was administration, I wasn't part of the meeting, right? You could tell by the looks on faces that was not their expectation that who I was and what I was coming for. And I used to have this thing, I would watch how aware of it I was. I would count how many seconds it would take for someone to talk to me instead of to Matt. So
how did it break down?
Oh no, it broke down, 6-1 maybe type of thing. And it'll still happen, right? But, you have to put in context of what's going on. But where I know I'm thinking this is probably an environment like that. And if they don't know anything about what I've done or who I am. So it's a real thing. The thing is I guess as I've gotten older, I realized that those are probably people that aren't worth my time if they're thinking that anyway. So, and I also think the more time I spent, the more antagonized I get on it. That it's even on this poker thing, right? This poker thing opens up sort of like some raw emotions. Like some men are like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I haven't taught my daughter. And of course, my son knows how to play. And it was just, but others are like, you're in our space, not cool. And either one, like, I don't expect to please everybody that I'm into, but I think over time, I think the biggest thing for when women talk to me about it now, what should I do? I mean, two places they talk about it a lot is raising money. That's one big one. And I think that's a tough one because the data is so bad. And I think there's a lot that can be done by women, but a lot that can't be done. Meaning,
And what do you mean by that?
I think the approach they have to take is like the approach at the poker table. It is, if I'm going to bet, I have to raise, which is not always true, but I'm just sort of overgeneralizing. Like if I just limp in and here's the big blind and it's however many chips and I just go along with everybody else and I just put in however many chips, or I triple the big blind. Totally two different things. And that reaction from the person on the other side of the table, which typically is a man who has the money to give, like they're going to have a different perception of you. And you have to talk about vision and growth and opportunity and not sit in a position of defense. And, there's a lot of studies out there on this whole subject. I think my experience is they're really accurate. And so we have to be more aggressive in those ways. And it feels really uncomfortable for the female, but like that is a tangible thing you can change. I think the attitude of the person on the other side is the part where you can't change, which is why it then therefore means like you either have to figure out what they've done before, have they invested in female-led companies before, whatever sequence of events, things that look similar to yours, so that you can not waste your time. But some of it is just going to be a waste of time. And I think generally speaking, people want to do the right thing, but it's really hard not to have biases when you're the investor. And we have to break those down, and we're going to have to show up in ways that we didn't. It feels awkward, which is why you get the practice. And you practice in front of the mirror, you practice at the thing, but you practice at the poker table. Like those are super uncomfortable places that are super tangible that women can work on.
Learning to sit in discomfort. We're way out of time, but I have to ask, we like to end on life hacks. And so much of life hacks is how people refill their bucket, create boundaries between work and home. But I wonder, do you even have boundaries between work and anything outside work?
Yeah, I'm not the best person to ask about that. I'd say at the top of my life hack list is really like what you're doing, because it helps when you have to make, compromises or you feel overwhelmed. It feels less overwhelming. But I will say two things that really helped me, like particularly as I was raising 4 kids, and I always used to say 4 kids, 4 companies, that's all I can do. And eventually we had more companies and things, but it was part of the reason why I wasn't public, because I couldn't do anything and more. But I would say ask your girlfriends when you don't know the answer, because God, they're so good. Everybody has so many experiences. So my college friends, my high school friends, I have friends from kindergarten that I'm still really close to. So, I grew up with 4 brothers. Those girls are wildly important, but boy, they teach me a lot every single time. Like if I'm like, whether it's about my work or not, just at home or what to do in this situation, all of it, they just have good gut on and way to help you. My second thing is like, it's fluid, particularly with kids. Like if you make a decision, like maybe it's for 3 months. It's not for 3 years. Like everything is going to change. They're going to change. They're not going to like doing that class or having that study routine or whatever it is. Like just make a shorter time frame commitments with your kids, because it's easier when you don't go all in. That's where you don't go all in, right? I'm going to hit singles here. I'm not going for the triple or the home run just to get through these times. And you have to make compromises. My ultimate, and I'll stop here. My ultimate compromise was like, I really want to give my kids a bath. That was like the one thing I wanted. And my nanny, she was like, I just want to bathe them. They come from school. They're so dirty and they play after school. It's like 4 or 5 o'clock. I'm not home. I was like, I finally had a compromise. And like, there are real compromises. I'll do it on the weekends. Some days I'll be home early, but like, I think flexibility and fluidity with kids and work is really important, and they learn it. That's how they later in life are able to work through problems too. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Flexibility, understanding how to take risk, when to go all in and not, both in life and in work. Jenny, This is awesome. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.